And I
I
will
am
note, oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry?
You can go ahead, Fran.
Oh, I am delighted to introduce Hunter Haskins. He is a senior at Roanoke College, and he is in the honors program. He is also Phi Beta Kappa. He is a Martinsville graduate that we are very lucky to have in our community for these past 4 years. Hunter is a double major in history and political science. He's pursuing a concentration in public history, and he is a member of the Roanoke College Honors Program. His areas of interest include 20th century justice issues and American foreign policy. This presentation tonight is part of his honors distinction project, the culmination of 2 years or more of research and field work meant to gauge and contextualize for the first time some of the effects of redlining in the Roanoke area. He hopes to one day work in or with a museum where he has the opportunity to research his interests further and help others embrace the history around them as they face the challenges of the 21st century. And I can tell you, whatever museum gets Hunter, they're going to be very, very lucky. So, Hunter?
Yes, thank you so much, Fran. And what I was going to say was that you may switch over to speaker view to see me, but I will inform you now that I do have a lengthy PowerPoint to go with this, and I'll be sharing with you a few resources that you can do your own research with after my presentation concludes today. And so with that introduction, thank you again so much, Fran. I did want to read off this list of people that I wanted to thank so I wouldn't forget anyone before I began. Obviously, I have to begin by thanking you, Fran, and also you, I saw you earlier, Alex, Fran Ferguson and Alex Burke in the Salem Museum as a whole, just being able to be so open and inviting to me to present this material, to go forth with my honors curriculum and show it to a wider audience. So that way, I'm not just the only one who knows all of this information other than my advisor. I'd also like to thank too, the Virginia Room, and specifically the Roanoke College Library, but also the Roanoke Public Library, and specifically those archivists there like Dimer Nick, who's been able to help me start my archival process on this, even in these crazy COVID times. I want to thank Liddell Windling and other professors and colleagues of his at Virginia Tech. He was very well-spoken and outstanding when I got to meet him as a freshman, and really his presentation helped kick off this progress and process as it attended. I also wanted to thank Dr. Kathleen O'Neill at Roanoke College for showing me how to make some digital maps, even though it's a limited part of my project. I wanted to thank also Dr. Herbert Timothy Lovelace Jr. of the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. Several years ago, he gave me some information on the Washington Park dump, and that also helped spur my interest. And to that point too, I'd like to thank Scott Shepard, a man who certainly, in light of everything that happened in his life, be able to overcome some of his issues about race and identity, to be someone who's an egalitarian and to put forth ideas that are happy and prosperous for all is something that's truly inspiring. In my last few batch of people, I have to definitely thank the Bassett Historical Center and all of my friends there that gave me an internship opportunity again last summer and volunteership the summer before that. And then in addition to my friends and family, I also have to give a huge shout out and a gracious thank you to Dr. Samantha Rosenthal. Her work and mine have just been going back and forth. And even if those corrections on my paper, Dr. Rosenthal, drove me a little bit crazy at the time, you always brought me back to sanity. And so I have to thank you certainly for that. So without further ado, I'll give a very short introduction of my project and a little bit about myself. Like Fran said, I'm from the Martinsville area, and I'm proud to say that I'm a Maroon and just about to graduate. But specifically, the history of this project and where it came from is that I was introduced to the topic through someone showing off a PowerPoint and a short website about 4 years ago when I was a freshman, saying, look at all these maps and this segregation in the city of Roanoke. Bet you didn't know about this. Certainly, I didn't know about some of that. And so from there, it's really picked up in 2017 and began to take shape in 2018. I proposed in 2019 and 2020 and really started that research in 2019. And this is the culmination of that amount of work that I've had. And so without further ado, as I pull up my PowerPoint to show y'all, I did want to just issue a small warning. Obviously, these are very sensitive topics, and it's something that shouldn't be taken lightly. So obviously, as we look at these issues, I want to always take this with the utmost sincerity and seriousness. And so from that, while I don't think it's that triggering, I think that here we'll go and try and begin with that. Let's see, is the sharing enabled, Fran?
Should be.
All right, perfect. I see that it is. So let's see if we can start from the beginning here.
And I would just mention that if anybody has a question or a comment, you could put it in the chat. If you can find the chat across the bottom of your screen, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, and again, thank you so much for being here. Now, I guess I have to start with the obligatory rhetorical question for y'all. What do you think of when you think of a map? You might think of something that leads you to somewhere. It's a guide from maybe point A to point B, or from A to Z. It's something that shows you where certain people live, maybe your friends or family. It shows you where they go to school at, maybe where someone works or where your children play. But either way, the map that I'm about to show you and devote a lot of this discussion towards is something that you probably haven't seen that before. It's certainly the kind of map that I just described. It's certainly a guide, but in so many bad and negative ways, it's the worst kind of guide, and something specifically that informs the federal government and then also others on a local and state level, and the ways that their cities should be constructed, how they should perceive their neighbors and their communities, and more importantly, how they should be, these ideas and these groups and others should be reconstructed, I guess in ways that you could describe as having an overall negative effect on the development of Roanoke. And so here's that map. Let you look at it for a second. So ultimately, this is what we call a Hulk map. That is HOLC. It's Hulk, or the Hulk, and that stands for the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so what you obviously can see is a lot of seemingly beautiful colors trying to be matched over different sections of the city as they looked in 1937. And ultimately, there's a huge backstory behind this that I wanted to get into. Spend a few minutes talking about that, and then specifically returning to what you see here in Roanoke and how this map of such negative proportions was made. And so in the 1930s, I'm sure all of you would understand, the Great Depression was certainly at its height. There was mass unemployment and other financial woes that nation that left nationwide so many millions in poverty, and also millions more precariously tipping towards that precipice of instability and futility, and be it job hunting, banking security, but especially at this time, home ownership. Now, in 1932, FDR wrote to office on a wave of trying to fix these issues and try to supplant and stop any of these further financial woes and problems happening to his citizens. And so, in that massive majority that he got being voted in, you've probably heard of his first 100 days and all the alphabet soup organizations that he created. And that includes, obviously, the Tennessee Valley Authority and so many other famous groups. But at the same time, he also created the Federal Housing Authority. And with that came the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And ultimately, what it was designed to do was to help those who needed financial help to refinance their home mortgages. So that way, if they were in default or nearing default or even getting close to foreclosure, these loans that they would provide through the government would be low interest to no interest, and allow those homeowners who got them not only the money to pay off their mortgage, but opportunities once they repaid that mortgage to really take off and then find new opportunities to expand themselves economically and financially speaking to different groups and crowds once the Depression was going to reach its end or near its end. Now, they did this through a very complicated process. They would take loans from the original lenders of the loans and use bonds to pay for them, and a lot of different information that's not completely relevant. But ultimately, that goal was that not only would the Hulk, or HOLC corporation, be able to make back its money that it was giving to homeowners, but so that way there wouldn't be any lingering or lagging debt, and that lenders also could walk away who were happy with the money being repaid on their loans, and there would be no foreclosures. Now, ultimately, this corporation started to make different loans to different groups throughout the country, but it was pretty soon realized that to be able to give out loans to anyone who was applying for them, they certainly needed to think about not only who was going to get the loans, but how they were going to distribute them. And so they decided to settle on some kind of empirical method, something that could be tested and shared throughout many different communities in the nation. And they settled on this, which is a color-graded map of a city. And so they targeted about 100 or so American cities, plus maybe the unincorporated communities around them. And ultimately, these cities were supposed to be prosperous or at least well-earning. And certainly you could say this was definitely the case with Roanoke. I'm sure I don't have to explain too much Roanoke history to y'all. Certainly, I know a lot about it now being at the college and then elsewhere you guys have lived experience here. But certainly Roanoke came from Big Lick and it was considered part of a new South City, something that arose after the Civil War in the 1860s. And so the proper city of Roanoke had merged between Big Lick, which was near the railroads that were coming through the area, and Old Lick, the areas that had used to exist near what is now Gainsboro and some of the other staging grounds before the Civil War. And it really formed in 1882 and was a completely burgeoning city. I believe it jumped 10,000% in population between 1880 and 1930 or 1940. In fact, with more than 60,000 people residents of the city by the time of this map's creation. And so with that, we can definitely see the results of that population boom here with this map. And now what we see is obviously a local map, 1935, transposed with 1937 dates and notes that you might be able to see just barely out of the top left corner, that this was completed in February, March, and April and May of 1937. And it was meant to try and ease fears within the city and help others make easier decisions about who should get loans. And it was designed by local realtors and those who had knowledge firsthand of this area that were contracted specifically by the Holt Corporation to make the job easier. But of course, now you're probably wondering, what do all these colors mean and what do they have to say about the region as a whole? And now I'd like to show you a little bit about what these grades mean and what kind of effects they had and maybe why they're not so empirical after all. So as we can see again in the bottom left corner, we can look at green as being the first grade or the best color out of the four that are there. Specifically, they're reserved for more wealthy or affluent neighborhoods. They're largely white or at least entirely white at this time when they're being decided between 1935 and 39. And from that, these are areas that if you're given a green color and you happen to live there, someone could look at the map from Hulk and see this is a green area. I'm 100% going to give you a loan for your home if you so need it. Meanwhile, we have blue, which is slightly more here on this map. There was 3% green, but about 10% of the entire map was blue. That is second grade. That's reserved for areas that are still desirable, not necessarily best like green might be, but they're the areas that are still well off or better off at this time during the Depression. And at this height, it's still largely, or in some cases, entirely white. Meanwhile, though, we have two different colors that are on the lower spectrum of those things. We have the yellow or third grade class. That's for areas that are declining for various reasons, be it home mortgage issues or other affecting areas, be it near industry or not. And this was usually represented by poor to middle class individuals and quite a lot of blue collar workers as well during this period. And while it's largely white, it is possible when they're looking at just the geographic makeup of the area, we can think of rolling hills, but also with regard to race, these people can sometimes be in mixed neighborhoods or immigrant areas. But certainly the case for red, that being the fourth grade, is certainly the opposite of that. Whereas green and blue most likely got their loans, and yellow was a 50-50 area, red was almost assured, if you lived in that area, to not get any loans of any sort. Like I just said, it's fourth grade or hazardous, and as it was described there, the area was poor in quality, either be it from the home or environmental factors. And these were minority-majority regions, most likely. There were very poor whites there, or perhaps some immigrant communities that were non-white, depending on how you might consider that or control that at the time of the 30s. And so ultimately, we have to ask ourselves then, what came about of this and why did this matter? And so I'll take a step back to tell you that coming to this project, we thought that there might be an even disbursement of the different colors between the region, but that's really not the case in Roanoke. To visualize that, I've put 100 dots on this screen. 46 of those are red, 41 of those are yellow, and only 13 are blue and green respectively. So again, to put that in perspective, so much of the city, as you can see here briefly on that map, that's 87% of the city is yellow or red. And that's largely concentrated around the middle, or in some cases like in Salem, which you can see just a little bit here in the south. But again, it just stands out in such stark contrast that there's so little of Roanoke that was considered green or blue. But back to what I was saying also about how I got here, was that I wanted to study these maps and I thought there would be an even distribution. But more importantly, when I learned about the presence of these maps and whatnot through a public history course, and specifically through a presentation, I really wanted to know a little bit about where Roanoke College was from. And so just to help explain how more specifically they did these assessments, these local realtors, I want to use Roanoke College as a case study because it really is at the heart of one of these maps. And even though the college hadn't developed, of course, like it is now, I do want to lead a little bit into that with how they did things in an appraisal form. It's smaller here, and I'll enlarge it in future slides, but each coordinate, each colored zone or neighborhood on a map was given this area description form. And it has various names, but I'll just call it the appraisal document for this. And here's the one right there for the blue region that's just north of Roanoke College, where I'm presenting now today, actually in Newhall. And so let's take a real quick look at what these descriptors mean. And so keeping in mind, these are supposed to be empirical documents, we can see here that it is very formulaic. It was created in February 3rd, 1937, or at least filled out there. And it seems to have very basic information at the top, we can say. The description is the terrain is flat. There are a lot of new buildings in the area, and there don't seem to be too many detrimental influences regarding housing or whatnot. But as soon as we get to plank 5, the inhabitants section, we start to notice a few red flags, specifically that the type that's listed of those who live here are the best people. What does that mean? You tell me. We then see different things that are very concerning as well. It wants to know the percentages of African Americans or the foreign born in the region, and that might lead to questions later of whether or not these were fair or very good at determining who was where and where capital was. Then we get into even more worrying things. Is there an infiltration of blank? There are none, whatever that means. And the same thing with relief families or some other things. Obviously, it goes into sales and rental values and a few other things, but I would like to keep your attention on that infiltration of blank there. Now, while Roanoke doesn't exactly have too many of these that are quite worrying, I can tell you that for a fact these are not empirical, simply by looking at other cities' documents of the same kind. For example, Oakland, California's infiltration of blank specifically quotes, and I'm quoting now, it is the infiltration of goats, rabbits, and dark-skinned babies. And the same thing is to say about how many African Americans were in the community, what kind of construction their houses were, or specifically, when we continue looking at this document near Roanoke, we can see that for clarifying remarks, they could put something like, there was a black family that's just moved into this white neighborhood. We'll give it a red rating because we don't trust that the community would stay away from African Americans or there would be a lack of influx of any individuals that are undesirable for a neighborhood. And so again, this supposedly empirical document really wasn't. And so with all that in mind, we can definitely think of that when we look here at this map. Now, I did scour to see what specific regions might be of interest. While there was some very interesting data about Southeast addresses not being desirable, some of these appraisal documents, and the same thing being said of different parts of Salem, like I showed you on the appraisal document previously, I really found a very interesting cycle and confluence of events when I looked at specifically the northwest section of the city, especially as it was developed and made in these mid to late 1930s. Specifically, I wanted to look at the Williamson Road district, that is circled in blue here, at least this specific part of the road. I wanted to look at the antithesis of that according to the Hulk map, that being the red circled area of Gainsboro and a little bit more of Gilmer and Harrison areas. And then I also wanted to look at something that might be considered a middling section of town. That's the largely Melrose-Rugby and Villa Heights area that's circled in yellow there. And all these areas in the Northwest have a very interesting, almost cyclical interconnectivity phenomenon that's going on between them that I'll elaborate a little bit more on in a minute. But I did want to let you know and become aware of some of these things and that how empirical someone might argue they were, they really weren't. And trust me, they had very long-term effects on the community as a whole. So without further ado, let me jump into the Williamson Road area. And again, like I said before, I have to thank the Roanoke Public Library and different books and sources that I have for the images that will follow, historically speaking, on the next few pages. But certainly there's a development story here that you don't want to miss. So the very first thing that I want to mention about this is that this section of Williamson Road, I tried to highlight it a little bit here, is that this area is neither the entire Williamson Road, like I said, nor was it within the city boundaries of 1937. when it was graded. And I want to make sure that's a very clear point, because it's very interesting to note that other areas graded might or might not have been within the city at the time this was graded. Now, specifically, this boundary that you see here is from 10th Street Northwest, that's the southern border there that I tried to include, all the way up to Hawthorne Road Northwest. That's in the Airlie or Arlie, I've heard it pronounced both ways, court district that you see as the little square on this box. And so the development of this area, especially as it goes forth in the color grading, especially of this area, suggests a particular keen interest, at least in the local realtors and Hulk Corporation, and where the city saw itself going, not just in the next 5 or 10 years during the Depression, but certainly after that, and what kind of use of this periphery landscape could be used in the future. And so I'll take a step back and give you a little brief history of Williamson Road. Is that traditionally, it's a high traffic area. It's something that helped move people from Botetourt County, when it was a little bit larger in the 1800s, down into what was Big Lick. And at first there were the stagecoaches, and then later on there's the development of the railroad. Yet the city's roads that went through that area before it was Williamson Road was really a hustling and bustling place, even into the late 1800s. And so the development really began in the early 1900s, when local citizens had a vested interest in trying to develop business in the area, especially after the Williamson family, which is where the road gets its name from, decided to sell its farm finally through eminent domain and other things to macadamize a road through the district. So that way there would be all sorts of different foot traffic in the early 1900s as the city expanded. And so with that, there came this huge influx of business. It started with a filling station in 1917 and grew by 1918 to have another and another and another. And so by the early 1920s and 1930s, what we can see here in this little document there is that different building corporations decided to take their turn at building not only businesses, but also houses. And so we saw the emergence by 1940 of over 1,000 new lots in the district. That's quite hefty, especially considering how many people were moving into these single and multifamily dwelling homes. And it continued to develop all the way up until it was colored blue on the 1937 map. Now, the properties there, as they were assessed in the actual appraisal document, say a whole lot about what the conditions were like at the time. The houses were of a brick veneer property. There was a generally friendly or neighborly atmosphere there. And then the houses that were being both built and then further constructed were about $5,000 in the 1937 range. Now, adjusting that for inflation, we know that's more than $91,000 in 2021 dollars. But things didn't just stop there after the Second World War had ended and some of that Depression influences had gone away. In fact, by the 1960s, as we know and recognize the district now, the business and the capital that had started there with a filling station definitely grew into something much, much more. And it really eclipsed some of those residential properties in the region. Although still a lot of people live there, we can definitely see that by the 1960s and 70s, as so many different groups and people talk about in their memories, this was the city's favorite historic strip. Teens would hang out there in the 60s and 70s, and it really enjoyed that capital that was coming in through the businesses. Not to mention that this area was still a mostly all-white area until the 1980s. This area also had so many inns, and it kept traffic moving through and through. And so this is the ideal sort of situation and area that the Hulk map was trying to idealize neighborhood to neighborhood. Now, with this in mind, we can now take a look at Gainsboro. This photo is of, I believe, the 1940s in the district, and it's looking down south. And I want you to remember this photo going forward, because I'll show you something that's a complete antithesis of it in a minute. Now, as I just suggested, Gainsboro is that antithesis of what Williamson Road was, at least to the Holt graders and realtors at the time who were assessing the area. I hope you can see a little bit of the blow up there on the left corner, but this area was within the heart of the city, not only old but new districts, part of Big Lick and Old Lick, but also something that had historically been there. Now, it also encompasses, as you can probably guess, not just the Gainsboro area, but parts of Gilmer, a little bit of Washington Park when you look at the map as a whole, but ultimately, this was an area that faced the biggest brunt of what the loan corporation had as its wrath. And regardless of whatever community strength was there, Hulk really just did not care. Now, again, stepping back into the history of this area, traditionally this was an all-white township, and it was named after William Gaines, a military commander who came through the area, and it was spelled Gainsboro with an E. It became over time, though, as the railroad started to build and change, like so many other American cities, that center of town became the area that African Americans started to be forced to live in. I believe between 1911 and 17, there was even segregation platforms and planks, local laws basically, that said African Americans needed to live in certain parts of the city. They were forbidden from others. I'll speak on that again towards the end of my presentation. But back to this, ultimately by 1920s, this was where the laboring class African American movement was, and they were all predominantly working on the railroad. Now, despite whatever Holt graders will eventually think, or anything else for that matter, we definitely know that there was an emergence of a very strong African American autonomous community in this region. And it's not only just so strong for the Commonwealth, really across the United States and the South particularly, this area was so tight. I think the first photo that you can see here is actually, I believe from Gilmer, but I'm not quite particularly sure. I know that it drives through that area and was covered by the Hulk maps. But then we have Tom's, which I believe was, I think, on the corner of Henry and Wells, if I'm not mistaken. But ultimately, we see not only these small mom and pop businesses and large thoroughfares and big roads being developed there, but we see actual cultural, and to quote from Melanie Foley, a knitted community growing. This was a center of arts. It was a center of community health. We had so many different influential people coming from this area. We can think of Oliver Hill, the famous civil rights attorney and lawyer who helped with the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit. We can also think of Lucy Addison, so named because of her high school, but also because of her trailblazing work as someone to pioneer some of the educational limits of African Americans in the city at the time and try and boost that. We can also think of even Edward R. Dudley specifically, who was the first African American United States ambassador, I believe, to Liberia in the 1940s and 50s. And so thinking of this and this knitted community concept, it's not surprising that maybe the city council at the time didn't really take too kindly to that. Specifically, the realtors on this map too, they decided to color Gainsboro red on the 1937 map. That local autonomy that you might have thought of, especially as I described it there, and it was something that was so touching to the communities and churches there, was completely denied. Instead, we have things affecting the community in an adverse way. Not only is there urban renewal, but there's also environmental discrimination. And so a little bit more about urban renewal and what was specifically happening there was that urban renewal at its base form in a more practical sense is supposed to get rid of certain parts of the city that are deemed blighted or not very eye appealing or might be bad for public health and safety, all in the goals of replacing it with something prettier, shinier, something that would bring in capital and profit to a city. And so by as early as 1955, there were already discussions from the all-white city council about what could be done to the Gainsboro area. Because as it showed on that map in the appraisal documents, the area was considered red. Income wasn't very high in the area, obviously because of the jobs that African Americans were restricted to, but also that some of the bungalows and houses that were in the district at the time were more than 35 years of age. And there wasn't necessarily a problem with the income of some individuals there, but clearly it wasn't quite enough for these graders. And so jumping forward about 30 years, we can think of these Holt graders again, leaving their legacy and mark on the council. And they decided by 1955 that something had to be done. And so different individuals have attested at the time and in retrospectives that they needed to clear out as much as possible. And so there was a growth of the Kimball Project or the Commonwealth Project. So many different jobs and projects throughout the 50s, really in the 60s, and especially taking off in the 1970s before they really disappeared. And so they completely reshaped the entire district there. And what you see in this picture is actually one of the processes and progress of that is the Berglund Civic Center. And that really came about as another project trying to renew the urban center of the city. And specifically this project actually ended up relocating, among so many others in the city, thousands of African Americans and sending them from their tight communities all across the region, something that they didn't expect, but more importantly, was something that was a break of their promises. No matter what promises were made about how the city would be able to stay together, or perhaps this would come together and make something better for the African American community, it was quite the opposite. And so you can actually see here in this picture that through eminent domain seizures and other things, that the Civic Center was built around actual neighborhood that was there. Thinking again about this picture that I showed you. Here it is looking down towards the east. You can see the water tower and other areas. Jumping again forward, we see the tragedy that is this area. And not only that, I'd ask you to look very closely to this picture. You'd actually end up seeing some of the houses that had yet to be taken in the middle of what is now the Berkeley Civic Center's parking lot. You can see at least 3 or 4 lots that are there, and that they're building the center around those that were holdouts. And eventually the city was able to shoo them away, but not without having to dole out significant amount of money to seize the land or push those that were there away. And so obviously that and the development of the highway was extremely crucial to urban renewal, but also extremely devastating to what was to come to the region and the district as a whole. And now we'll jump over to my third and final district that I looked at specifically, that being the Melrose-Rugby district. And this is a photo from the 1960s on the left that you can see on your screen, looking out towards that area of the city now. But more specifically, thinking about Melrose-Rugby, I'd like you to keep that in mind yet again. And so, like I had suggested before, that yellow district of the Melrose-Rugby section and those surrounding areas is a middling ground on this map. You can say that just like Williamson Road, it was actually outside of the city limits as well, part of what would eventually become a suburb, just like Williamson Road was promised to be. But also, it's just like Gainsboro in the sense that it's given a lower rating, specifically as we read on the appraisal documents for that, because of the African-American and poor white presence in the area. And specifically, just to get to that district, you have to drive through the African-American neighborhoods. And so, of the demographic of this area at the time, we can say that so many of the members there were originally white or Caucasian, and they were a lot of blue-collar workers. They were on the rail, and they were different clerks throughout the offices in the city, but they were really blue-collar or middle class before a sudden change that I'd like to detail for you in greater depth in just a minute. So, yet again, jumping back into the past, this part of the city was actually developed alongside the streetcar when it came about really in the 1890s to the early 1900s. And so, even considering the impact of corporation building in Williamson Road, Melrose-Rugby was really the land of several competing developers trying to make the land more accommodating for all those that were moving into this burgeoning city. And specifically, I'd like to highlight the Rugby Land Corporation. It was run by a gentleman named R.R. Fairfax, or Ronnie as his friends called him. And so he was a vicious land developer. He wanted to try and build so much of the city in the models and influences that he liked. He began with Villa Heights, and the Rugby Corporation actually ended up building Villa Heights, and then tried to move on to this district. It was responsible for so many of the houses being built at such a quick rate up until the early 1930s. Now, a little bit, again, briefly about some of the workers there. Like I said, they worked on the Norfolk and Western Railroad, but specifically, some of them were also working in the viscose plant on the southeast side of the city. And this industrial kind of work was extremely dominant throughout this region and other parts of the city, especially as you look towards the inner city. And so, again, this area is building up and building up. But even then, by the time of the Depression, it affects everyone. And stagnation in the area comes down to just 3 houses being built a year. It was colored yellow as a result of that on the map. And there are 99.9% of the families at that time were white. There could only be one example that I found of a quote unquote Syrian family that's living in the region at the time. Now, of the specific appraisal document, there's some praise for the brick veneer and frame style houses there, but ultimately it's getting a yellow grade because specifically it couldn't be given all these loans because you had to quote approach through Negro and poor white sections of the city to get there. Now, you would have thought that maybe with this rating, they expected the streetcar and other positive influences to go away. And ultimately, what would be left in the region is just a bunch of African Americans and no, ew, we don't want to give loans to them. But actually, you would find quite the opposite. If the Holt graders expected the area to become predominantly African American by the early 50s, they were proven wrong. In fact, the area soared with some of that economic boom of the 1950s that Roanoke and the rest of the nation saw. And it also became a sort of model suburbia. And those middle-class train workers continued to work on trains, but they certainly grew their capital over time. It became quite a prosperous area in town. And so you might be left thinking, well, did the region buck the trend? Did it become something that wasn't declining after all? Ultimately, I just have one point to make about that. That is the year 1958, and actually how central it is to the development of this region, but also that as a shock point around the entire city. So in 1958, 2 incredibly huge things happened. Really 3 if we count the third thing of being another plant. The first being that the Norfolk Western Railroad was one of the last holdouts to finally convert their engines from diesel to steam. As a result, we can see with this steam engine here, that had a huge effect on the job market. thousands across the city lost their jobs overnight, especially here in this Melrose-Rugby district, where these laborers had been working 20, 30, sometimes 40 years on the railroad. And suddenly, with the conversion of diesel engines, individuals were no longer able to positively contribute and get a job there. Meanwhile, in the exact same year, the viscose plant across town, even though it's employing less people, actually ends up closing as well. Then, in the same year, that second or third big point that I wanted to raise was that urban renewal projects, just like I'd mentioned in Gainsboro, had started to begin in the Gainsboro region. Specifically, by 1958, we were looking at the Kimball and the future Commonwealth projects to begin. And as they are starting to eject homeowners into various different parts of the city, this really confluences into this one big event. Now that there are no jobs in the region, now that African Americans have to find new places to live, white individuals start to flight from the area. It's called a white flight, or they move away to different parts that are more prosperous in the city. And so African Americans start to move in by 1960 and 61 and really start to change the racial demographic of the area by the time of the 1970s. And by the 1980s, it was already majority African American, whereas the region had been completely white just a few decades before. And so by this point in time, you're probably wondering maybe, what's the connect between all three of these things? Well, I have to tell you that actually, looking back at Melrose-Rugby's specific appraisal document, you will find in the margins, just after it makes note of the approach through poor white and Negro areas of the city, that there's a desire by the residents that live there to move to somewhere else in the city. Specifically, they want to move to a wider, more prosperous area in town. And the area that it lists is labeled B1. What is B1? But the Williamson Road District. And so that exact same area that was prosperous to so many in the 1930s was the area that so many in Melrose-Rugby wanted to move to. And it was quite the opposite of what was expected of Melrose in Gainsboro. And so you see this very interesting cycle. You want to live in Williamson Road, you can't or don't want to live in Gainsboro, and you don't want to live in Melrose-Rugby anymore. So you'll move to Williamson Road if you're lucky enough to be white. And so where does that lead to us today? More specifically, the 21st century and what we can come from that. I went to the different districts. I tried to go to Allendale, which is an area that I didn't study for my assignment, but I wanted to make sure that I visited for the homes just to see what the varying quality is between certain neighborhoods or districts as they would be plotted today. And of course, what you'd find there is quite shocking. Obviously, the areas that were A or green back in the 1930s really do still reflect a lot of that wealth that was there today. The same thing could be said slightly of the Williamson Road District, even though it had some of its issues in the 1980s and 90s. It was still something that's still profitable, and some of the neighborhoods that are still there, especially in the Airlie or Arley Court area, are still in remarkable condition from what they were. Meanwhile, funding has been left or pulled from certain specific areas in Gainsboro and in Melrose-Rugby as they represent D and C districts, or red and yellow respectively. And so ultimately, I have to also draw attention to this. Whereas African Americans were predominantly in the center of the city or towards the northeast side, at least in the 1930s, as a result of these and so many other segregationist views and platforms that were going on in the city in the 40s and 50s, things just completely changed throughout the city. And so I'd like to draw your attention here again to something that's quite disappointing within the city, is that this is a racial dot map. And it's compiled of trying to put down a dot for everyone who's a certain race or a different graphic living in a different household. And so ultimately, we can see blue dots or Caucasians, green represents African Americans, red and orange and brown represent various Asian ethnicities or Hispanic and other ethnicities, respectively from that. And so what we can see is that why there's blue in so many circular districts there, towards the northwest and specifically the west, as if you're going towards Salem, you can see so many African Americans living in that district as opposed to all Caucasians living towards the east. And I'll try and leave you on that one note before I transition to some of the other things that I want to tell you about, was that in a study done in 1996 by the University of Michigan, it was found that Roanoke was among the top 10, in fact, the most in this state at least, of the segregated cities in the United States. And it has remained so even to this day, despite some efforts by the council to at least try and acknowledge this past. Ultimately, it still remains as such within the 66th quartile, I believe, for certain data. And when you compare certain elements of demographic changes and switches, it remains so to this day. And so I'll stop my share for a minute to say a little bit of a thought about what I just spoke about and what happened in this district at the time. Obviously, this is very concerning data. It's something that not a whole lot of people know about, or maybe they know one part about, or maybe another part. They're not completely aware of this history. And so really, I wasn't aware of it either. We're left wondering, what can we do? And what kind of perspective could we offer on trying to enlighten ourselves with this history, or at least go forward trying to understand our role in it, what we might do to be able to fix that. And I'd like to share with you just a few resources that you can actually look at yourself to understand maybe the placement of the city now and how you might be able to affect and understand your own background and where you are. And so the first thing that I'll show you is a little map that I had tried to create with some data and photographs originally of the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. And I tried to plot them on a larger map of Roanoke City as a whole. And I'm starting here in the Green District, but we can actually see them layered on the real streets and roads that exist in the city today. And while I had some pins stuck to the map, with any technology issues, they disappeared. But nonetheless, I think the statement still stands, that there are others online who are very keen into this and can actually plot it down district by district, and they can see where those blocks are today and how they might still affect different neighborhoods. This can also be said here too of the Salem district. We have that here as well. But this isn't the only thing that we can say that we could share or bring apart as a light of that, is that there are other actual historical resources that you can look at. I'll stop my share so that I can pull up my other tab and show you actually here too. This was the resource that I was shown that really spurred my interest in trying to bring about more change in studying this phenomenon. And it was Mapping Inequality, a website by Liddell Windling and others at Virginia Tech, to try and bring about more reckoning and acknowledgement of these issues. And we can see again here, not only just the different parts of the city, but we can click a specific part, click Show Scan. You can actually look at the scans yourself. You can read about your district, where you're from, and perhaps some of the values that were attributed to where you are. And so this here is for the area that I identified as Gainsboro, listing some of the family income and how it's so different from other areas within the city. And of course, you can zoom in and see different parts of the city. We can roll over here to where Salem is here on the map, look at different parts there as well. This was the document that I showed you in my instructional part. And so with that, I would like to just conclude by saying thank you for giving me your time and attention. And I hope that this presentation has inspired you to maybe not only look into your history of where you live, but maybe think about your role as a member of your community, understanding maybe where you live is one aspect of it, but also understanding your neighbors, your friends, and where others in the city might come from is something that I really want to leave you with today. And so with that, I'm happy to take your questions. I'm happy to stay until well after 8 if need be, but I'm very excited to see what you guys have to feel for me and if I can help any on understanding this important history.
All right, we've got a number of questions already. Was the HOLC a private company? Did it have any government connections?
Yes, that's a great question. It actually was a government corporation, as it was part of that founding of the FHA, or the Federal Housing Authority, as it is. It was deeply tied to the government and how the government was going to try and, specifically from an executive and legislative branch point of view, try to extend some of the mortgage opportunities to so many Americans, so that way it would fix a national problem. But there were private elements to it. Of course, like I said, they hired local realtors and contractors to try and deal with these issues and actually do the mapping process. But it was very deeply tied to the federal government. And that was part of some of my larger research to do, more so with my overall paper than it was here. But certainly that's a very good question about maybe the ties that this corporation had to the government and maybe some other things more broadly.
Okay. Were African Americans compensated when they were relocated?
It depends, of course, on what you mean by compensated. In some instances, they were giving promises and ideas of how they could move to different districts, or maybe they could have this or that given to them. But largely the answer was no. They might have been given small directions, but ultimately they weren't given too many things to make their travels easier. I believe there was a Bloomberg article that interviewed a local district citizen who said that when we moved, not only were we not paid, but we were not ever given a chance to actually see some of our friends again. Just the moving of it was so jarring to the community that they really had no opportunity to really reconnect with those friends and that tighter bonds that they used to share in the 1940s and 50s. It was completely wiped away almost overnight. And as it waned away at the neighborhood, you could definitely say there was no real compensation for what was done.
Wow. The next question, is it correct that not only did they move homes when they built the Civic Center, but they moved the African-American graveyard? Many young children were buried there. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That was a really important thing, was when they were building that highway, there were several graveyards, so I believe congregated under one or two different names, and they're escaping me now, but that was actually very important in understanding what was going on, was that they actually exhumed hundreds, if not thousands of bodies from the city center where these historic graveyards had been, just so that way they could build this highway. And so ultimately with that came the pollution, but also bodies being moved from areas that they originally were. And of course, pointing this out, this was not a luxury that was afforded to African Americans that maybe if they had to move a white graveyard, they might have gotten the chance to. And I don't want to speculate, of course, on where the highway could have gone or some things like that. But certainly as we look at that, there were thousands who were exhumed, perhaps unjustly.
Goodness, okay. What type of redlining exists today?
Sure, this is a great question. Some might note that because redlining was outlined, and I did forget to mention this, of course, when things were colored red, that is what is redlining. I can't believe I made that oversight mistake, but yes, when I refer to redlining or others refer to redlining, it's those areas that were colored red in districts. Referring that question to what's today around, you might be easy to believe that because redlining and things like this were outlawed in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that brought around different houses and organizations, you might be remiss to think that, hey, maybe this doesn't exist anymore because the maps are gone or whatnot. Unfortunately, I can tell you that it's quite the opposite. A lot of banks, I believe Wells Fargo, at least as late as the 90s, built their own forms of these maps, but using different bank collectors and mortgage lenders to actually look at where individuals were at the time that might be minority or less likely to pay their dues, and just group them together and not treat them or give them their own private mortgages and loans. Yes, I actually believe someone in Roanoke settled a lawsuit in 1998 or 99 on this issue, specifically from Wells Fargo. I know that it still continues today with also urban planning and different things and districts trying to redesign certain neighborhoods. Fran, I believe you actually shared this with me, that certain areas can be correlated now to where they were colored red back in the 1930s. They're more, or rather less likely to have trees or actual greenery environments in which community parks or other places can be organized. Obviously, it's very variable between city and district, but ultimately, this really brings to light so many troubles of lasting legacies, but more importantly, maybe things that postal codes or how we organize how we pay for schools or taxes or things like that really come to light because of the results of not giving a mortgage loan when someone needed it 70, 80 years ago. And just the ripple effects of that are truly stark and a little bit concerning, just to say the very least.
Well, the next question is about the postal codes. Whoops, where did it? I got extra questions and I bumped it. Hold on. The postal codes, I feel the postal codes we continue to use in our Roanoke addresses are tied to redlining. Do you have any thoughts about this issue?
I have some. It really wasn't in my area of study that much about the postal codes, though I did try and look into that with regards to maybe finding out more current census or data when we were looking through the progress of the last year. And ultimately, they're overlapping, except for some instances of, I believe, the Melrose-Rugby district and some of the Villa Heights area that was covered in the map. And so while I didn't specifically look directly into all of that, I know that there is some data to show that in other cities, postal codes are deeply tied to that. And so there have been talks from lower level activists and leaders to try and change postal codes and what's said of that. But specifically with Roanoke, I wouldn't be surprised if you could find some correlating information about postal codes or zip codes and addresses to what's actually going on the ground in some districts.
Did the right of eminent domain force the government to pay fair market value to the African Americans who were displaced near the present-day Civic Center?
Another great question. This is very important when we're thinking about eminent domain and paying for prices. And this can actually be tied a little bit into redlining. With areas that had poor mortgages or poor ratings on Hulk maps, we can specifically correlate that to what happens later when eminent domain might become a problem in certain sections of the city. Let's again take Gainsboro, where I spoke the most about eminent domain being a problem. The city would pay, of course, for their properties, but again, also turning back to my compensation question, is that what they would do is they would look at some of these maps, they would look at later assessments in the 40s and early 50s to determine, look, this land and mortgage property is basically useless. This property has no value to me. It's run or owned by an African American sometimes. And as a result, I don't think I really need to give them that much money for the land. It's not worth that much. And I can find two contractors to tell me that this is land that should be condemned. And so whereas a house might be historically powerful, be it in Melrose-Rugby or something historic like we might find in Gainsboro in the 1950s, ultimately that value is not taken into consideration at all. Not the community aspects of it, not the actual value of the property itself. And it's often way undermarked from what it should be. Whereas in they're only getting $1,000 or $2,000 compensation for land that would bring in $10,000, $12,000. And so the only ones who were getting any kind of quote unquote fair compensation or anything like that when it was eminent domain buy-ups, was likely because they were holdouts. They were in the parking lot that they needed desperately for the Civic Center. They were in an area that needed to be built so bad that we'd pay any price to get you to leave. So that way we can bring in more business or capital, bring in more affluent whites, whatever it is for whatever city. Especially that's the case here in Roanoke and what we saw looking at the data.
Right. Another question. My hometown, Zanesville, Ohio, had several African-American neighborhoods bulldozed to build Interstate 70. So this has also happened in the North. Hold on. Were highways responsible for other city destruction events?
Oh, certainly. And while some of that was tied in with the redlining in Roanoke, and of course, I'm not familiar too much with the Ohio case, I'm sure if you looked it up, you would find a whole lot of correlations with the building of the highway system in the 50s during the Eisenhower administration, implicitly tied to whatever rating or color grading it was given in the 30s and 40s. And so while I don't know too many specifics about that, I won't wade too deep into that. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if they were that tied or interconnected. Thank you for that question.
Certainly. Well, I think, do we have any more questions? Anybody else typing into the text?
Yes, this is Sally. I typed it in, but I don't know how to get it to go anyplace. But my question is, what did the political scene play during that time with relation to the drawing of the lines for the voting areas?
Thank you for that question, Sally. That's really important. While I didn't really want to wade too much into the politics of that, you're right, it is kind of inevitable when you look at city council politics or things like that. And from what I can understand, the realtors did not have necessarily any politics in mind when they were drawing those up. And so with voting districts already being established, I will say that Roanoke's a little bit of an oddball in that African Americans, for the South that is, African Americans actually voted at a much higher rate than they did in other Southern cities. I believe the voter rolls in the early 1900s, for instance, of the voters' population, 100% of voters, I believe 39 or 40% were actually African American. And so understanding too that Democrats at the time were the largest voting bloc in the South and that they had a virtual stranglehold because of the Byrd organization or anything else in the state controlling it as Democrat led for nearly 100 years at this point. Certainly we could think about how districts might be lined up or written to think about keeping a Democrat in place or someone who is corrupt and trying to keep out the then liberal or more moderate Republican Party from taking power in the city. Now, I can't specifically tell you too much more about maybe why a district that was outlined or not giving loans at the time might vote for one political party or another. But I think that whenever you think about breaking up districts for gerrymandering or modern day voter suppression or trying to limit districts so that way one can stay in power over another, that's something to keep in mind and I think would benefit from further research, looking into maybe not just Roanoke, but something on a national scale as well. So thank you again for that question.
Goodness. I just keep thinking about all of the history and culture and the people that have come out of Gainsboro, like Oliver Hill, and to consider that area not valuable is just hard to stomach, hard to understand.
Yes, ma'am. And I am sorry that I had to speed so much through that data, but as I think that you could take away, all of y'all, that it was so much information and it was so much to think about and to try and process as we consider maybe the implications of ourselves now. And I keep repeating this, but where we go from here in the future. Maybe not just acknowledging it as a thing of the past, but understanding maybe some of those long-term legacies and effects that happened in the 20th century as they continue just growing and changing throughout the years. So it is very sad, but I hope that some of that information is informative to y'all and continues to be long beyond that when you do your own research.
Were there any African American banks that were able to spring up and serve this area, to step into the void that was being left by other institutions?
I'm sure there were. I'm not personally familiar with these because I will tell you that these maps that I showed you have only recently become available in the last 4 or 5 years. They've been known about, but they hadn't really been talked about before 2010, 2011. But really, they weren't even discovered because these were private maps. These were maps not meant to be seen by the public, nor were the appraisal documents specifically. They were only meant for high government officials, those who are high in the lending markets and departments, and thinking about that, but also considering how things changed over time, these weren't really rediscovered until the writing of a book called Crabgrass Frontier by the author's name is Kenneth Jackson. That is the writer of Crabgrass Frontier. He was doing research on other suburban projects, and he literally stumbled across these maps at the bottom of the National Archives. And this stack that was going to be forgotten and placed away and probably not looked at again. And so while there might have been banks to step up and fill in that, at the time, maybe mysterious gap of not lending to African Americans from the government level, not knowing about these maps certainly had a negative impact on trying to fight these repercussions as they were developing.
We've got a few more.
This is Judy. I have a question. I have been down to Corner Springs where they moved the 800 and some folks from the cemeteries to the Corner Springs and put them all in one grave. My question is was there any difference in them being able to walk in to knock on my door and say, we're going to take your house because we want to do something? Was there anything different that had to be done for them to be allowed to move those 838 people from that cemetery down to Corner Springs?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Judy, for your question. I will cover this and say that I'm not that familiar with the specific processes of what they did with that moving, but I can tell you that it was probably done in an official manner, trying to at least cover themselves by saying this is an official city act or this is something that the city needs to be done. I know that there have been several write-ups about this, but also specifically some work that you can actually find looking at old WSLS Channel 10 archives, looking at some of their recordings and write-ups of some of those city council meetings, trying to determine how quickly or what we can do with an urban renewal progress and how can we get started on that. And you can also hear some of the backlash from those African Americans protesting at the time, not to mention certain civic leaders like the Reverend R.R. Wilkinson at the time of Hill Street Baptist Church in the 50s and 60s. He was at the front of this, leading the Virginia NAACP on this issue. Perhaps if we were to look into that, we would find specifics of maybe grievances or complaints of those individuals who are being affected. But to return to your question, Judy, I would imagine that it would be some kind of an official platform, but if anything, it would have been at least maybe implicitly implied through beliefs that the African-American neighborhood was not a strong community, or that it deserved to be changed because it was blighted, or because it was not as knitted as Monique Fuller describes it. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
We have a few more comments. Thank you for your research and presentation, Hunter. Wonderful presentation. I hope you are writing a book. Are you working on a book?
I am not at this time, but I will say that the 40 pages that I wrote so far about it feels like a book.
Well, when you insert the maps that you've got, you certainly have a lot more pages than that.
Perhaps.
Let's see, this is such an important topic. You did a fine job. Hunter, your old first grade teacher is oh so proud of you.
Oh, would that be Mr. Gregory? It is Mr. Gregory.
It is
Thank you,
Mr. Gregory.
I started I'll say this if you're still on the
Thank
call.
you.
Oh yes, Mr. Gregory, you showing videos of history has put me in this direction to go down this path of learning about history and political science. You saying all those things, you would show us videos that I guess others in class weren't interested in, but I was always there to pay attention to them. I still to this day remember a video that you played about how the Washington Monument is built out of 2 different types of brick. That's trivial information, but I remember it. So thank you for that.
That is
You
so
make
cool.
us proud, Hunter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our teachers at every level have done a wonderful job.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Dr. Rosenthal has noted it looks like Mary Bishop is here tonight. Yes, she is with us. Her series on the Roanoke Times in the 1990s on urban renewal was groundbreaking, and I know it influenced Hunter's work.
Yes, and this is my first chance to actually see you, Ms. Bishop, and to thank you so much for your writing and research. That has built so much of what I was researching, not just about Roanoke's past, but understanding its connections to modern day. And your series was a huge part of understanding that and writing about that. So thank you so much for your research and work.
Gratitude for teachers and journalists. Absolutely.
Stones in 2 different times. He said no one else may have cared, but I never forgot.
Yes.
Let's see, someone who said, I just hope you are.
Somehow we lost the lion.
Oh, well, Mr. Gregory, I think you're off. You're
No, I mean,
unmuted.
it went off completely.
Are you still there? Okay. And then someone said, I hope you were considering becoming one of your awesome teachers yourself.
It's definitely in the works. We'll see. No, I would love to be a professor or a teacher talking about these issues. It's very important to continue educating the next generation, of course, on any of these issues.
Well, this has certainly been a marvelous and informative talk tonight. Do we have any other comments? Any other questions? Hunter, do you have anything else you want to, parting words you want to leave with us?
Yes, 2 things. The first being that if you do have any further questions that you'd like to think about, or maybe send to me at some point in the future, I will tap or type my email, my school email into the chat. So that way, if you want to reach out and have any further questions or want to speak about anything, I will always be available to talk about this issue and understanding it. Make sure it's typed right. Yes, it is hbhaskins@mail.roanoke.edu. So again, that is hbhaskins@mail.roanoke.edu. And I would be more than happy to take any questions that anyone has or thinking about that, especially as I go forward. My graduation is in just over 2 weeks, and I'm just so excited to maybe carry forth this knowledge and then apply to the other things that I'm interested in, and just continuing forward from there. And with that, I think that's all she wrote, or all he wrote.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an incredible presentation. We did get another thank you. This was fantastic. So grateful for the knowledge, and thank you for sharing. So we really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight and to share this really critical information that informs so much of what things are like